Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti. Thanks for joining me today in this discussion that we're going to have on the cerebrum. That's right, the cerebrum. What could be more complex? What could be more important? What could be more interesting and relevant than a discussion about the cerebrum? And I hope you find it interesting and enjoyable as well. It's the largest part of the brain. It's the most conspicuous. You could see it right here. It's the classic iconic view of the brain or cerebrum, where most of the other structures, apart from the cerebellum, which is down over here posterior, this is the frontal area here. It's what most people think of when they think of the brain, and there's a lot going on there. And so I'm glad that you're able to join me in this conversation that we're going to have today. So, one of the things that I'm going to say right out of the gate is that it controls all of our conscious thoughts and all of our perception of our senses, and it dictates and commands, and it tells our muscles to move, and it houses all of our intellectual functions. And so I put this image here, put on your thinking cap, get ready for this video. The shout out to my students at the Community College of Vermont. So glad that you're here joining me in this conversation that we're having on the cerebrum. And so the cerebrum, just wanted to point out a couple of areas. It and the top part right up here, the top part of the cerebrum, there's a place where it processes sensory information, and that's right, sensory information. And so, do you notice right here? Let me just be a little bit more clear. There's a line that sort of separates right in here. It's referred to as the central sulcus. Okay, and I'll come back to this, but over here, just behind it, right here, is a somatosensory area, and that's where senses are going to be processed. And then just in front of it, right here, this is what's known as the motor cortex, primary, because this is what's going to detect and direct motion, right, in this particular area. So these are some of the things that we're going to be talking about in this video. And so other things that will be coming up is I mentioned this sort of cognitive thinking and decision making occurs over here in this location of the brain. If you're wondering how do we know some of the things that we know, that's a complicated question, and it's a fair question. Part of it is through decades of research in neuroscience. Part of it is amazing technology, imaging, like for example this functional MRI right here, which is showing us more and more where different processes are occurring in the cortex of the brain, the cerebrum. And so let's talk a little anatomy so that we can get some common footing here. So if you took the brain and you sliced it right here and you were looking at it front on, in other words, a frontal plane, you'll notice that there's gray matter toward the outside. So toward the outside of a structure or an organ, it's referred to as the cortex. So this is the cerebral cortex, and it's gray matter, those of you may know, is because of the fact that it has many nuclei or soma of neurons, and so therefore it has a darker appearance. Whereas the white matter has more axons, in other words, tracks of extensions from the neuron, which are myelinated and therefore giving a white appearance because of their lipid density. Okay, so you have gray matter and you have white matter in the cerebrum. And also, I promised that I would mention this here, that you'll notice the brain has all of these convolutions. And so you'll notice here that each little fold is known as a gyrus, or gyri for plural, gyrus for singular, or sulci for plural, or sulcus. Do you see this indentation right here? It's referred to as a sulcus right in here. And this increases surface area of the cerebrum, and therefore increases the number of cortical neurons, and therefore increases the brain's ability. So pretty awesome. You'll notice here in this orange line that there's a larger, deeper groove called a fissure. And since this is separating the left and the right hemisphere of the cerebrum, it's referred to as the longitudinal fissure right there. It separates the hemispheres of the brain. Now, the two hemispheres have different functions, although they're structurally similar. And that'll be part of our discussion today, looking at some of the functionality of what's happening. But they're structurally similar. So I wanted to point out something kind of intriguing at the top of the video, which is I find kind of curious. Like, for example, you have a right eye and a left eye. So an image coming in being picked up uh, from the right side, in other words, the right visual field, is then being picked up by the retina of the eye and then brought back by the optic nerve. And then there's sort of a little cross over right here. There's a optic uh, chiasm, chiasm that occurs, and this allows for images from the right side of the brain to be picked up over here on the left hemisphere, and in particular on the back part, which is where the primary visual cortex is being picked up back here. And then again, images from the left side, optic chiasm, is being picked up over here, over on the right side. And so there's kind of a cross that occurs inside the cerebrum. I find that to be pretty cool. So similar situation is occurring in the somatic sensory information coming into the body from one side. It's being processed on the other side in the brain. Like, for example, if we're picking up something in terms of temperature, or we're feeling something in a sensory neuron, that afferent neuron, the unipolar neuron, is going to be then bringing that information up here. Here's the dorsal root ganglia inside in the spinal cord, and then it's going to cross over and it's going to be perceived and detected over here. I mentioned before in the primary somatosensory portion of the cortex. Okay, so same thing over on the other side. It's crossed over to that side of the hemisphere. And so let's talk a little bit about lobes. I mentioned hemispheres, but there's also lobes of the cerebrum. And those are named after the skulls for which are protecting them or that are directly above them. So we have the frontal bone, which is on top of the frontal lobe. Then we have parietal lobe. There's two parietal lobes on both sides of the brain. And then we have a temporal lobe right here, right below the temporal bone. And then we have the occipital lobe, which is right behind the occipital bone. And so we have these various lobes, okay, of the cerebrum. I wanted to point out this particular area right here, this central sulcus, right in here that's highlighted in blue. The central sulcus is able to divide the anterior toward the front, the frontal lobe, from the posterior parietal lobe, as you can see right there. Okay. You might notice there's a couple of other cool things that I'm not that are not highlighted here, but this is the pia mater covering the left side of the hemisphere. The pia mater is the innermost meninge, which are layers that surround the brain, and then the arachnoid mater. In this case, it's villi, because it's sort of convoluted, but that particular layer, as you can see over here, is just above that, and then the dura mater has been removed. In other words, the hard shell of the brain. The central sulcus, as you can see right here as well. Okay, so this is a lateral view of the brain, of the central sulcus. Right. Now, this lateral sulcus, which is shown right down here, is going to separate the frontal lobe, which is right there, frontal lobe, from the temporal lobe, which is located right over here. Okay. And then we have this one, the Parietooccipital sulcus, which is located back here, as one might imagine, that separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe, which is located most posterior, right in this area. So a little anatomy right there. So here's your parietal lobe, here's your occipital lobe, here's your frontal lobe, and here's your temporal lobe, located right here. Now, the truth be told, if these were not labeled, it's sometimes difficult to delineate where exactly something starts and stops. But further, the more that you're studying this, the more you'll be able to identify those particular landmarks that separate the lobes, like, for example, the central sulcus we were just talking about, and the lateral sulcus. That is what you use as a guiding measure. Like, okay, there's the lateral sulcus, there's the temporal lobe, and there over there is the frontal lobe. That's that sort of thing. So it's possible. Now, I find this to be pretty cool. So if you were to take that lateral sulcus and you get some retractors and you literally pull it back a little bit, you'll see that there's sort of like a little island or isla of lobe cortex that's actually inward that you cannot see unless you retract back along that particular sulcus, and it's more medial to the lateral sulcus, meaning more towards the center of the brain. I mean that to be kind of interesting. Here you can see it in color in a cadaver. So you take some retractors and pull it back, and it's highlighted right in here. So it's a deep folded part of the cerebral cortex, and the fissure that's separating the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe and the frontal lobe right in this area. But if you pull it back, you can see that sort of little island of cortex below, and it's thought to be, and it's when I say believed to be, because we're always learning more and more about the functionality of the brain. Let me assure you, not everything is known, and there's more to come. And so perhaps you'll be involved in discovering something about the functionality of the brain in your future studies. That'd be cool. So it's believed to be involved in consciousness and plays a role in all kinds of diverse functions, ranging because it's a little bit more internal. So it has an association with the limbic system. So there's an emotional component to this particular area, and it also helps to regulate various homeostatic mechanisms, or in other words, keeping things regulated inside the body. So let's look down the superior view of the brain, and again, here's the longitudinal fissure right here, and now we're looking at the different hemispheres. And I wanted to point out here, you'll notice this precentral gyrus. In other words, it's just to the front, right in here, precentral gyrus, and then just behind that area right there is the postcentral gyrus, right in here. And I bring these to your attention because those are particularly important areas that we're going to be discussing shortly, and I mentioned them at the top of the video. This post-central gyrus is going to be a primary sensory area, and this pre-central gyrus is an area where directions are given for conscious movement or of motor function, in other words, movement of muscle. So those are really important areas of the cerebral cortex. And so I'll come back to the cerebral cortex in a moment, but I should point out that there's all of this white matter below. And so when we get into this conversation, I want to make sure that I'm giving equal due to not only the cerebral cortex, which is the gray matter, but what's known as the subcortical cerebrum. In other words, the white matter, because it does matter. So it's white because it contains myelinated axons that are projecting from the cerebral cortex. So the soma is projecting its axons down all the way through to not only to cross between the hemispheres, as we'll talk about, but also all the way down into the brainstem and down the spinal cord, for that matter. So this is the frontal plane of the brain, indicating this white matter. So let's talk about this white matter that's part of the subcortical cerebrum. And so I wanted to mention there's fibers that move that connect one hemisphere to the other. I mentioned that. Those are known as association fibers, and you can see them here. So these association fibers come in two kinds. So they're referred to as the commissural, in other words, bridge, commissural fibers. That these are bands of fibers connecting the two hemispheres, commissural fibers, and those are not shown in that particular picture, but we have these arcuate fibers, which are short, as you can see up here, these arcuate fibers, which are connecting um, different gyra to one another. And then we have these longitudinal fasciculi, which are longer bundles, which are shown right here, that are connecting frontal lobes with other lobes of the body and within the same hemisphere of the cerebrum. Okay? And then we have projection fibers. Now, these projection fibers are the ones that are, if you will, connecting the hemispheres right in here. I'm sorry, misspoke. The commissural fibers are the ones that are connecting the hemispheres, as you can see in red. But the projection fibers are the ones that are actually traveling all the way down into the midbrain and down into the brain stem, and then all the way down into the spinal cord and back and forth. So you get these projection fibers that are sort of ascending and descending right in here. And then we have the commissural fibers. So these commissural fibers that are going laterally, side to side, one of the more pronounced commissural fibers is a structure known as the corpus callosum. And it's a band of white matter, and that, again, that's obvious, or maybe not obvious, but it's white matter because it contains axons, as you can see here, the corpus callosum. And so it's interconnecting the hemisphere, and it allows information to travel from one cerebral hemisphere to the other. Corpus callosum. Here's the coronal section of the brain. You can see the corpus callosum here, and this is all the white matter. This is the gray matter of the cerebral cortex. So this is one of the more pronounced commissural fibers. But there's another one as well that I wanted to point out. There's this interior one right here. Do you see this right here, this bridge? So here's the corpus callosum right there, which is really significant. And then this is the anterior commissure right in here. Now you may notice, look at these lateral ventricles right here that are separated. These are chambers of the brain. This is separated by a septum, sort of like your nasal septum, but it's not a nasal septum. It's the septum pellucidum right over here. All right. But so these are white matter commissural fibers that are connecting the hemispheres to one another, and the corpus callosum being the more significant. Now, these projection fibers, as I was saying before, are the ones that are traveling up and down, not only from the cerebrum, but all the way down into the spinal cord. And so they link the cortex, the outer part of the cerebrum, with the diencephalon and all the way down to the brain stem, all the way down to the spinal cord. But they also go down into the cerebellum as well. So that's pretty cool. And so an example of some of these projection fibers is a particular area, this white area, which is known as the internal capsule. Okay, so it's a band of white matter in the middle of some gray islands, if you will. So this is where all the ascending and descending projection fibers or axons are traveling. So it's a significant area. So internal capsule. So check it out. It's right over here. The internal capsule. Do you see that right there and right there? So these are the projection fibers that are traveling all the way down and then ultimately down in the rest of the body. Internal capsule. Now, more detail about that. So here's the internal capsules. You can see, look at all the branches of tracks, if you will, of axons that are traveling down, and then all the way down, I mentioned before, into the brainstem, the midbrain, the pons, the medulla, and then all the way down the spinal cord. It's kind of in the shape of a V, if you will, and then the fibers sort of tease themselves out and go to different areas of the cerebral cortex. It's kind of V-shaped, this internal capsule. All right. Now, I also wanted to point out, do you notice here the gray matter doesn't just exist on the most peripheral part of the cerebral cortex. There's also some bodies, if you will, of gray matter that are sort of inside the brain and sort of in between areas of white matter. Like, for example, that I was just mentioning, the internal capsule. Let me go back to this picture. Do you see the internal capsule right there? There's these little islands of gray matter. Do you see that right there? And so let's talk about that. So there's these masses of gray matter. And again, the gray matter is gray because it stains a little darker, and it's darker in appearance because there's a lot of soma in that area. So they're embedded within the white matter of the cerebrum. Okay, and it plays an important role in motor function, helping the motor neuron area of the cortex. It's one of its functions, and it's referred to as basal nuclei. So basal ganglia. So many terms, but don't get overwhelmed. Don't be intimidated. So basal meaning something like below or low, and nuclei because that's what we're talking about. These are the soma and the nuclei. So ganglia because they're pronounced structures. In other words, they're masses of soma, which give them the form, which is what the term ganglia is coming from. So the basal ganglia are gray matter within the internal structure of the cerebrum, and so they also help to direct subconscious activities as well. And so you can get really into this, as one can imagine. This is brain science. It's not for the weak or faint of heart. So some of the functions is it's thought to play a role in cognition. It's thought to play a role in emotional function as well. Again, associated with the limbic system as well. And you'll notice some of the names right here are kind of this one in particular, lentiform nucleus right in here. Okay, so these are the particular basal nuclei, which are the gray matter, which are below, which are like little islands, if you will, in the middle of all this white matter. Okay, and then here's those important projection fibers that occur in the internal capsule that I was mentioning before right there. Okay, so a little bit more. So there are various names for these basal nuclei, and again, with a variety of functions. But I just wanted to point out the fact that there's gray matter below, not just on the cortex. I find this picture to be particularly interesting too, because you can really see it three-dimensionally in terms of what these structures are really all about. Okay, and so you can see the gray matter located here, although it's colored, but you can see all sorts of other structures. Here's the pineal gland, the fornix, which is this structure, this arching area right in here. You can see that they're showing a little bit of the ventricles. Here's the third ventricle. You can see over here the lateral ventricle. We were talking a little bit before, just to give you some orientation about the septum pellucidum, which is right here. Okay. So again, just to sort of close the book on the function of these basal cell or basal nuclei, ganglia, they're involved in subconscious control of muscle, skeletal muscle tone as well. And it's believed that they're involved in the coordination of learned movement patterns like walking. Incredible. Okay. And then finally, this lateral perspective right here from the side. You can see how the gray matter has these really cool sort of scale, sort of like hooking, arching kind of particular structures that are found in the internal part of the cerebrum. Now, in this area, I have to mention this. There's some other basal nuclei. There's another group of subcortical, in other words, below the cortex, cerebral nuclei that are very significant. And collectively, they're referred to as in these two lobes right here, the thalamus. And so that you might be familiar with the thalamus, it's sometimes called the diencephalon, which is named after the embryonic structure that it develops from. So the thalamus, what's that doing? Well, that plays an important role in relay and routing sensory information, because most of the sense neurons are passing through this thalamus and they're being processed there. So that's one thing. And then not only are they being processed there, but then nerve tracts then carry it up to the cerebral cortex, which does even more processing. You can see here in green the two left and right thalamus. Okay, so getting back to the cerebral cortex. Okay, so I wanted to make this really clear because I think it's rather important. So in the cerebral cortex, the outer part of the brain, the gray matter, it can be divided into two particular areas. There's one area known as the primary complexes that are sort of uh, the motor area that directs movement. So the direction of movement. But then there's a primary sensory location that is detecting the various senses of our like, temperature and feeling and pain and those sort of things, and detecting sound. But then there's other areas in the cortex that are referred to as association locations or association complexes. And those are the areas in the cerebral cortex that what we were about to talk about that are involved in understanding and perceiving what it is. So in other words, you can hear my voice, and that's being picked up by a primary sensory location. But then understanding what I'm saying and recognizing my voice and what I'm talking about and understanding occurs in another location entirely. And so this has to be discussed. And so these, I was mentioning before this again, here's the frontal lobe right in here. So the central sulcus, which is where this pointer is going, the central sulcus right there is separating this primary motor, which is toward the front right there of that, and then the primary sensory area, which is just a little to the back of the central sulcus. And so this is again detecting sensory information, detecting it, but the motor is sending and directing muscle movement. But in terms of sensory, there's different association areas where you're going to be able to recognize and understand what those are, what senses are all about. And so again, here's a nice picture showing the central sulcus. And so what we talk about is the pre, which is towards the front, and the post central gyrus. So this is an area right in here, which is primary somatosensory, and this is primary motor, which is in the red. Okay. So this motor area is, again, trying to really emphasize this, is the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. Here it's highlighted in blue, so you can clearly see it. Again, if the blue wasn't here, it might be tricky, just saying, but again, takes time. It directs voluntary movement. So this area is directing your muscles to move. It's the primary motor cortex. Yeah, there it is. Okay, so there it is, right there in red. Okay, now this post-central gyrus is with the sensory area. So this is receiving sensory information. So the afferent messages are coming in to the brain about, oh, I'm touching something, I'm feeling pressure, ouch, it's hurting, I'm temperature. All of these things are being picked up in this particular area right over here, highlighted in blue, which is the post-central gyrus. Okay, and there's lots of images that you can find that are kind of cool about this. So this is where the particular areas, can you believe this, that the location in the body where if somebody's touching your hands and your fingers, this is where in the brain you'll actually be detecting that. Okay, I find that to be kind of interesting. So again, just to really emphasize this, so the primary area is the basic directing. It's detecting the sensory stimulation. And the association area is one of the areas that are it's characterized because it's far developed in the cerebral cortex, in the brain in general. And so it's necessary for us to remember, to recognize, and to perceive the various senses. Okay, and so these are what were referred to as sensory association areas that monitor and interpret the arriving information coming from the sensory area of the cortex. So this interprets the inputs. So basically it's trying to understand what is happening when sensory information comes in. So in other words, visual. So you might be able to, again, when the vision comes in, it's in the occipital lobe in the back that you're actually interpreting. Yes, I understand. I recognize that person. Or auditory association. In other words, monitoring the fact that I do understand what I'm hearing. Okay, so um, and then I wanted to also point out in terms of association um, that just in front of where the movements are being directed, like right over here, over this premotor area, right in here is the association area, which is where it sort of coordinates learned movements. I find that to be kind of interesting as well. Hopefully, you're not becoming too overwhelmed by all this. Like, just stay with me on this. And so, basically, this somatic sensory association area is what people love to talk about when they want to talk about the cerebral cortex. They want to say, look, this is where we taste. Look, this is where we see things. And again, we have some confidence with that. I want to point out through years of study in functional MRI, but I wanted to note that really the it's complicated, and so it's not precise. I cannot say with all confidence this is exactly where hearing is occurring. This is exactly where touch is coming. But I can give you this basic introduction to those concepts. In other words, I mentioned this before. The primary motor cortex is the voluntary control of skeletal muscles. That's important. The primary sensory cortex is the perception of these various things. We're confident about that. But as far as the visual, the auditory, these kinds of smell and hearing and olfactory, they occur specifically in certain locations, but there's a little crossover. Just saying. So take it kind of lightly from this point on when it comes to the association centers of sensory information. So we have smell and taste generally in these areas right over here. Okay, so smell, olfactory, and taste is occurring right in this particular area, right in here. So, for example, if you're smelling and tasting a nice cup of coffee, right in there. And then hearing, like for example, when we hear something, oh, I hear something, but then we interpret what it is. It's a bell. Maybe it's the ringing. It's a sound for breakfast is coming. So that's being picked up in the temporal lobe. Okay, so that association center is in the temporal lobe, which makes sense because it's pretty close to the ear. Okay, and then we could actually maybe we come downstairs and we say, hey, there's a nice cup of coffee waiting for me, and the visualization of the cup of coffee is happening over here in the occipital lobe. Okay, so the understanding that is a cup of coffee right there. So the information. And then we get, in the parietal lobe, we have some things in the cerebral cortex in terms of spatial manipulation. In other words, like when we're trying to get a sense of, space in terms of grabbing the cup and orientating our spatial location, and then also things like, for example, the heat of the cup are being picked up in the parietal lobe as well, or perception of that. And so these, all of this information is then in some instances are integrated. And so we have these particular integration centers that receive information from a lot of different, both sides of the cerebral hemispheres. And what they do is they try to analyze this. And so let me give you two examples of what I'm talking about in terms of integration areas. This one area known as this Broca area, okay, and it was Pierre Broca was working with some patients that were injured, and they had damage to their brain in this particular area highlighted in red, and they lost their ability to speak after an injury to this particular this sort of posterior area of the frontal gyrus, right in area, and it became known as the Broca area. And so this is now an area which we believe is important to coordinate vocalization function. In other words, to generate speech in this particular area. So that's kind of interesting right there. I just wanted to point that out. Now, there's another area, this sort of Wernicke area. It's located in the temporal lobe on the left side of the brain. Um, and it's involved in comprehension of speech. Okay, now when I said that the Broca area was sort of the production of speech, the Wernicke area is basically trying to understand when somebody is saying something to you. It's being uh, understood in that particular area. So it's present, curiously, only in one hemisphere, um, and it receives information from all of the sensory association areas. And so it's kind of, if you will, I'm mentioning speech, but it's sort of a general area as well. So it's coordinating all kinds of things. So not only like what you're seeing and comprehension, basically what you're, if you're reading, if somebody's reading to you and you're looking at the words, it's kind of where you're trying to figure it all out. Um, I also need to point out that in addition to those two areas, this blue area is this prefrontal cortex, the, the most interior part of the frontal lobe, is where the most abstract intellectual functions are occurring. In other words, predicting the future events or the consequences of various actions. Decision making is occurring over here in the prefrontal cortex. So that's an area of total interest. And so I also wanted to mention that the hemispheres, there's sort of this lateralization occurs. There's functional differences between the left and right hemispheres. So each cerebral hemisphere is performing certain functions that are not ordinarily performed by the opposite hemisphere. And so this is also something that's kind of common. You'll hear people discussing this, whether left brain or right brain conversation. And so in most people, the left brain, so the left hemisphere, is controlling things like reading and writing and math. Okay? And in decision making, again, that's occurring more in the front, and speech and language. As I was referring to before, these are on the left side of the brain. The right side of the brain has more to do with, again, related to senses of touch and smell, sight, again, toward the back, right in here, and recognition of faces and voice inflections, the right side of the brain. Okay? And then finally, I want to talk to you a little bit about how brain activity is monitored. This is kind of a clinical finish to this conversation about the cerebrum. So we have the ability to attach electrodes onto patients, right on top of the skull. And so what this is that we're looking for by doing this, we're looking at electroencephalogram, or EEG, electroencephalogram. So electrodes, I said before, were placed on the skull, and that it can actually detect electrical activity that is occurring in the neurons within the brain. And these are detected as little waves. And I'll show you an example of a printout of this in a moment. And so we've categorized these particular brain waves in four basic types. There's alpha, beta, theta, and delta. So let's look at these. So this is what I was telling you about, like a printout right in here. And these are known as the alpha waves. And so this is sort of, if you will, normal. So found in healthy, awake adults at rest with the eyes closed right there. So there you go. And so the beta waves are more high frequency and found in adults that are concentrating or mentally stressed. I could say, like, for example, those watching this video might be exhibiting beta waves. So theta waves are found in children right in here. And so check this out. These are a little bit of higher amplitude right in here, and they're also found in intensely frustrated adults. And I find that to be kind of funny too, because maybe the adult is frustrated because they're actually hanging out with the kids. And so they're both exhibiting delta waves. But it could, on a serious note, it could indicate brain disorders in an adult, these theta waves. And so that's an indication. Again, a physician might want to take a look at these following some trauma to the skull, for example. And then finally, the fourth type of wave is a delta wave. You might be familiar with this. These are um, part of everyday conversation. So these delta waves are the sleep pattern that you have that that you'll normally see. So it's found while you're sleeping, but it's also found in adults that are awake with brain damage. And so this would be very detrimental if you're exhibiting delta waves while you're awake. And then finally, I wanted to mention this, that a seizure, okay, is, okay, so these are normal waves, the brain waves right in here. A seizure would be a change in the EEC of a patient. And so this rapid, high amplitude right in here, high frequency, is the result of a seizure. And a seizure might go unnoticed, but then again, it could also turn a person unconscious. And it can also result in involuntary muscle spasms, or what are known as convulsions. And so both of those are not good. Okay, so just to sort of wrap this up, hopefully you enjoyed this conversation about the cerebrum. I know it's very valuable, and it was sort of a basic conversation. There's a lot more to be studied, like all things. And so hopefully this is the beginning of a great journey that you'll have studying the cerebrum. And I hope you enjoyed this particular video. And thanks for watching.